Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the land of Jesus as we begin our study of the life of Christ. Just to look on the global scale to see where our map is, we have a place where Europe and Africa and Asia all come together in the Middle East, this tiny little land of Canaan. In the days of Jesus, it had been broken up into a number of small provinces, so that we had Judea in the southern part of the land of Canaan. Moving northward, we had Samaria. This was given over to a group of people known as the Samaritans. They were sort of half Jewish, half something else. And then in the north, around the Sea of Galilee, we have the area of Galilee. The word Galilee means circle, taken from the circular shape of the lake. Over to the southeast side of the Sea of Galilee, there was the Decapolis. The term means the 10 cities. And finally, south of the Decapolis, we had the area of Perea. It was a geographical designation where that was ruled by a tetrarch, ruler of a fourth part. Herod Antipas is going to rule over Galilee and Perea during the days of Jesus. Now, you have a large mountain range that goes from north to south along the west side of the Jordan River, but that's broken in a large, wide valley, the Valley of Jezreel. Let's take a look there. The word Jezreel means sown by God, and we're looking from Mount Carmel out across the Jezreel Valley, and off in the distance we can actually see perhaps the tiny village of Nazareth, because it was right on the edge of the village, on the valley. There's Nazareth looking across the valley from the ancient site of Megiddo. And if we can zoom in on just this section, the Valley of Jezreel, we'll want to get a close-up of the valley. Here we see Megiddo and Nazareth. Nazareth was such a small town in the days of Jesus that it was barely mentioned in any sort of historical writing, historical document, unknown in the Old Testament, and even in Jesus' day, it was just a tiny little village. We think of Jesus as a carpenter. That's the way sometimes we translate the term as it's seen in the New Testament. But actually, he's described in the New Testament as a teknon, a builder. And certainly he would have probably worked with wood, but also, if you look at the makeup of this house in the background, it's made of stone. Wood was a very valuable commodity. You didn't have a lot of wood available, but you had rock everywhere. And so Jesus was probably a construction worker. Yes, worked with wood when he had it and when that was available, but more often than not, he was probably working with stone. Here we see an example of somebody separating the wheat from the tares. They're dragging a heavy piece of board or rock or something over the grain that's been gathered up into an area, and they're using that to grind the grain. Then at a later date, they will be throwing that grain up into the air, and the lighter chaff, now that it's broken up from the grain, will blow away in the wind, and then the grain will fall back to the earth. Jesus is going to use things like this as illustrations for his parables. We think of Jesus born in a manger. Again, we sometimes have our European outlook on this. In Europe, there's plenty of wood. So if you want a horse trough or some sort of a manger feed, it's made of wood. Not so in Israel. Wood is a valuable commodity. And so a manger, more often than not, is going to be made of stone. Here we are in replica of a first century synagogue. We don't have the fancy chairs. There's maybe a place around the outside for people to sit. But the whole town would gather on the Sabbath to hear the scriptures read because these were people of the book. Now, if we were to leave Nazareth and go just a few miles to the northwest, we would come to a city called Sepphoris, which was present in the days of Jesus, and yet both in that day and in the ensuing generations, it would grow into a place of Gentile culture, a city of considerable size that had things like a theater and had various things that have been located there that reflect a Gentile, Jewish and Gentile community both. Sepphoris had been destroyed by the Romans after the 4 BC rebellion, and then Herod Antipas had changed the name of the city to Autocrasus. So there in this location we have a theater. We have mosaics that were in private dwellings, a large amount of Gentile influence, because Jews didn't normally go in for this sort of artwork. Now, if we can leave Nazareth and make our way up to the Sea of Galilee, today we would come to Tiberias, although Jesus never went there. Tiberias was the seat of the local government, so that Herod Antipas would have had his place of rulership, his palace there at Tiberias. The Sea of Galilee, sometimes that can throw you when you hear the word sea. We should remember that the Sea of Galilee is really a large lake, about 5 to 7 miles across at its wider point. Maybe from end to end it's about 12, 13 miles, which means no matter where you stand, you can see across it, even on sort of a cloudy day, which we're looking at in our picture here. It's actually 500 to 600 feet below sea level, and so this is a low spot in the world. It's going to get much lower when we get down to the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee becomes the location of many of the miracles and teachings of Jesus in his Galilee ministry. Now, if we can circle around the Sea of Galilee, we'll come up to Capernaum. That was one of the tiny villages, and it's going to be the center for Jesus' ministry. This tiny little village of Capernaum. Notice it looks almost like a jigsaw puzzle. These were what were called insulas. These were homes, and people would build their home, and then as their children grew up and got married, their children would move right alongside, maybe right next door, and build up their home. And so what you had, we look at that and we think maybe townhouses, but this was the regular, maybe fishing family, or the families that grew up here in Capernaum. Everyone was probably related to everyone else. Everyone certainly knew everyone else. You had one church in town, we would say, one synagogue in town. We're looking at the synagogue. It was centrally located in the village. Now, this is a 3rd century synagogue at which we are looking, but it is built on the foundations of the 1st century synagogue that would have been present in Jesus' day. Here we can see the foundation stones. The black basalt foundation stones reflect the older synagogue, its foundations, and then this newer synagogue had been built on top of it. This was a small village, as we said, where everyone knew everyone. No secrets, small town life. Everyone hears about everyone's business. Jesus, as he's teaching here, would use things like the millstone. We see examples of this, both millstone and olive press, and people. They were simple farming, agriculture, fishermen, just the sort of the salt of the earth. One of the things that was located, that was discovered just a few years back, is called the Galilee boat. It was a boat that was found. Now, we're not saying this had anything to do with Jesus, except to show what boats were like in his day, because this boat was about 2,000 years old. It had been sunk, and even in its best days, probably doesn't look all too sturdy. You can imagine being out on the middle of the Sea of Galilee in something like this when the wind begins to pick up, and it could be rather treacherous. Now we want to leave Capernaum and move northward to the ancient site of Laish, also known as Dan, but in Jesus' day he would come here to Caesarea Philippi. To get there, we move up the Hula Valley. Today this has been all filled in, but back in Jesus' day it was a bit swampish. We're crossing the headwaters of the Jordan River as they flow down from the melting snows of Mount Hermon. And we come to this place known as Caesarea Philippi, named, of course, after Julius Caesar. And in Jesus' day, it was the site of a pagan temple. There were temples there built to the god Pan. You can go there today and still see the grottos that were carved out of the mountainside against which the temple stood. And Jesus is going to come here with his disciples. They're probably going to be wondering, what on earth are we doing in this place of paganism? And he's going to come here and he's going to ask them, who do men say that I am? And they'll come up with different answers, but then he'll say, who do you say that I am? And Peter will say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now let's move down to the Jordan River. This is a very old map, compilation of National Geographic magazine back in the 1960s, and it's showing the Jordan River as it winds its way southward. Notice that the Jordan it's a river valley set very low, and you can see on this valley where in times past the floodwaters, the river would rise and flood this entire area, water it, and then the river would go down after the floodwaters had ceased in the summertime, and it would make its way very gradually as it works its way down toward the Dead Sea. It's a very slow-moving river, a river, in fact, even today you can see people being baptized in the Jordan. But then as it finally arrives at the Dead Sea, it straightens out, and by this time it has descended to more than 1,200 feet, and actually closer to 1,400 feet below sea level. And the Dead Sea is actually sinking even as we speak. The Dead Sea called that because the very high salt content means that there are no fish that live in the Dead Sea. And it was here at on the shores of the Dead Sea, a old plateau overlooking the northwestern part of that sea, that a community known as Qumran existed in the first century. These were the folks who wrote the scrolls that have been discovered, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were discovered up in the caves overlooking the Dead Sea, and nearby was this Qumran community, this place where these Jewish people had left Jerusalem because they thought Jerusalem was just getting too secular and too worldly for them, and so they came out here to the desert to be alone with the Lord and to copy the scriptures. And fortunately, those copies, they hid them in caves, and they've been discovered. And in some cases, copies of the scriptures that are 1,000 years older than anything previously had by scholars. And so it has been a wonderful boon for textual criticism and the study of the scriptures. These caves, a number of them were found. This one's a cave 4. They're numbered by the. Anytime a scroll was found in a cave, they said, well, that would be number 1, 2, 3, 4, in the order that the scrolls were found. So this is cave number 4, right near the Qumran community. Some were quite a bit further away. This is an artificial cave that was carved into the soft sandstone so that the scrolls could be left here. Now, if we move further south along the Dead Sea, we'll come to Masada. The word Masada just means fortress, and it is a fortress, but it rises. There's a natural rock formation that was utilized by Herod the Great to build this great palace/fortress complex. Today, there's a nice, easy cable car that takes you up to the top of Masada. In the old days, they would have to walk the snake path. But now let's turn to Jerusalem, the city of God. Now, Jerusalem is located just west of the Jordan River. It's about 18-20 miles from the Jordan River, going up that high ridge. It's uphill all the way from the shores of the Dead Sea, which are, we said, 1,300 to 1,400 feet below sea level, all the way up to Jerusalem, which stands around 2,200 to 2,500 feet above sea level. So it's an uphill walk all the way. If you go to Jerusalem today, the first thing that you always see is the Dome of the Rock standing on the Temple Mount. It stands where originally the temple once stood. The topography of Jerusalem, if you can imagine a hand being held upside down over on the right hand of our screen, you have the thumb, and then the fingers looking a little bit like maybe a mitten. You folks that live up north know what that is. And the outline of the walls that you see are not the walls as they existed in Jesus' day, but the Crusader walls as they exist today. Now, those walls have changed, but the basic topography has not changed. So notice that Jerusalem was surrounded on 3 sides by steep ravines. On the north, not so much. And then through the middle of the city, there was another steep valley. The old part of the city, known as David's City, was on the on this sharp ridge that jutted down from what would later on become the Temple Mount. Let's look at a model. This model is in Jerusalem, but it shows the layout of the city. First of all, we begin with David's City. This is the oldest part of the city on that narrow ridge that juts down from the Temple Mount. There's a water tunnel that actually goes from one end of the city to the other, Hezekiah's Tunnel. It would have been there in Jesus' day, but probably not a lot of people doing the walk through the tunnel as we're doing here. The water would come out in what was known as the Pool of Siloam. Now, what we're saying here is the Crusader Pool of Siloam. I'm not sure it looked like this. It wouldn't have looked like this in Jesus' day. These are Crusader monuments. But the water flowed out into a big, wide open pool that was only discovered in the first part of the 21st century. In fact, I had an opportunity to visit it just after it had been partially excavated. It still has not, the excavation has not been completed. Here's an artist's representation of what that pool looked like, and that's actually going to be part of the story, for example, in John chapter 9, where Jesus is going to encounter a man born blind, and Jesus will tell him, go and wash in the Pool of Siloam, and that man will make his way down here to this pool, and then come back, and on his way back, he will have regained his sight. Now back to our look over the city. As we move to the west, we come to the lower city. This was the poorer section of town. It was in this wide valley known as the Tyropoeon Valley. And then I move further to the west, and I come to the upper city. It's upper city because it's higher. And this was the more wealthy part of town. This was the place where people like the high priest might have lived. It was also the scene of a large palace on the far western side, a palace of the Hasmoneans. We'll talk a bit later about who those were. The former kings of Judah in the intertestamental period. But now in this day it would have been used by both descendants of the Hasmoneans like Herod Antipas and also by the governor of the city, Pontius Pilate. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, you'll see David's Citadel. Now, it's named after David. He didn't have anything to do with building it. But it was on this site that there were one of three great towers that Herod the Great had built overlooking the Hasmonean palace. But now let's come to the Temple Mount. The area that's best known to people is the western wall of the temple. And there are a series of gates that took the traveler up to the top of the Temple Mount. Now, there's one arch that was noticed by someone named Robinson, so it's gotten the name Robinson's Arch. And you can just see from the curve of the arch what this big giant bridge leading up to the temple would have looked like. Today, just the pieces of it are lying down in wreckage below. Another picture of Robinson's Arch where you can see the stones just barely lying on top of one another, leading up to that great retaining wall around what would have in ancient times been the temple. In fact, in those stones, one of the things that was located was an inscription, and it says in Hebrew, "To the place of trumpeting." It may have been here that every morning one of the priests would come up to this location and look to the east, and when he saw the rays of the sun beginning to come up over the Mount of Olives, he would sound the trumpet that this was the time for the morning sacrifice, this was the time for worship to begin. As we said, the western wall of the temple, that's very well known to us, a familiar landmark. And you can see the Herodian stones on the lower two-thirds of that wall. These are the great massive Herodian stones as opposed to the Crusader stones that are up at the higher part of the wall. Now, that wall, the way it would have looked in Jesus' day, notice that, and I'm just outlining the part of the wall that we saw, what would have been there in Jesus' day. It went much, much lower, a good 50 to 60 feet below the current ground level, and much higher than it goes today. So as big as that western wall looks today, it was much bigger, both higher and lower, in his day. And yet, even today, we look at it, and it's a wonderful architectural feat as we look at the size of those great retaining stones. It continues to be a place of prayer. Both they have a women's section on one side, a men's section on the other. And here, looking at a portion of the women's section, you see just the bare outlines of what in Jesus' day was a gate. It's known as Barclay's Gate because he was the one who first noticed it. And you can see a huge lintel and a huge side beam that would have gone far below the present level of the ground to form one of the entrances, taking you up through the mountain and up onto the Temple Mount. Here's where Barclays Gate, that portion that is today mostly covered up. Now notice there's an archway called Wilson's Arch leading underneath some of the structures and alongside the Temple Mount. Let's take a tour up into that arch. We'll walk through. Sometimes it's closed off, but we'll walk through. And on the inside, we'll see remnants of these archways that held up the crossings, that held up both a aqueduct as well as a bridge that took one across the Toropian Valley and up onto the Temple Mount. In this case, what we're doing is we're looking straight down. They have it covered by plexiglass, so nobody will fall off. But we're looking down 50 to 60 feet, where these same stones in the wall continue to go down far below ground to the level that they were in Jesus' day. We find another gate that again led up into the Temple Mount. It's been walled off so as to not allow anyone access. And we're going to continue the whole length of the Temple Mount, noting the stone foundations, where in some cases we have a single stone that might be as long as 30 to 40 feet long, weighing tons upon tons upon tons. Warren's Gate is another gate that's nowadays underground, but archaeologists have uncovered it, and it was another entryway into the temple. And now we come to the south wall of the Temple Mount. This was the main entrance. On our model, we can see that there were two gate assemblies. Actually, the model's incorrect. It has two gates on one side and two gates on the other. It should actually be 2 on the left and 3 on the right. But they didn't know that when they built this model. And so nowadays that they have uncovered this, you had the steps leading up to the Temple Mount. And there's what are called the Huldah gates. Notice 3 instead of 2 on the right and then 2 on the left. Named after the prophetess Huldah from the Old Testament, from Josiah's day. And it was here that you would come, coming up through these Huldah gates. And you would come out on the other side, and it would bring you up onto the Temple Mount, and you would find yourself in the court of the Gentiles. Now, as you approached the temple proper, there was a low wall that surrounded the entire temple assembly, with signs every so often in the openings of that wall saying, "No Gentile beyond this point, upon pain of death." Once you got past that, you could find yourself in the court of the women. That's in our foreground here. And on the western side of the court of women, there were 15 steps leading up to the giant bronze Nicanor gates. Past that, only men were allowed to go. And if you were an Israelite man, you could only go a few feet further anyway. And then you would find yourself in the court of the priests. And then the temple proper stood just beyond that. Now, today, as we said, the Dome of the Rock stands on the Temple Mount, but you will notice that the Dome of the Rock is on a elevated platform. That you were dealing with a mountain, and we go up to the very highest place of the mountain, and that's on the place on which the Dome of the Rock stands. Looking out here from the Temple Mount, of course, I'm looking to the Mount of Olives in the distance. And that sums up our trip around Israel and our trip around Jerusalem.